Here's your news for July 28th, 2020. And your headlines for today include: Kairi Sane has officially left WWE, says goodbye to fans. Vince McMahon is planning to host Summerslam 2020 on a boat. Two more interesting venue plans for Summerslam 2020. What's next for Sasha Banks? Triple H and Adam Cole individually apologized to Pat McAfee. Current WWE superstar turns down Impact Wrestling Hall of Fame induction. Lacey Evans threatens WWE that she will walk off. Vince McMahon on going back to Saudi Arabia, Hall of Fame 2020, and more. We're kicking off today with news from Raw as Kairi Sane's in-ring career with WWE has come to an end. Though Sane defeated Bayley on last week's Raw, the SmackDown Women's Champion got her revenge with a backstage assault this week, writing the Japanese superstar off TV for good. On Twitter, Sane described her time in NXT and the main roster as incredible, and said her accolades over the last 3 years were able to happen because of the constant, warm support from the fans. Time will tell where the Pirate Princess will drop anchor next, but for now, we wish Kairi Sane the best of luck in whatever the future may bring. Whilst a backstage attack probably isn't how Sane wanted her WWE career to end, things weren't much better for her tag team partner Asuka, who lost the Raw Women's Championship to Sasha Banks. A rematch from Extreme Rules, this match had a bonus stipulation that the title could change hands via pin, submission, countout, DQ, or if there was outside interference. The Empress lost the gold when Bayley attacked Sane backstage, forcing Asuka to leave the ring to help her friend, giving Banks the countout victory and the Raw Women's Championship. Much like her friend, Banks is now a double champion, holding the Raw Women's and WWE Women's Tag Team titles, and she and Bayley have shown no sign of giving up their spot on top of WWE's women's roster. Banks won't have long to celebrate her big win though, as Nia Jax returned to Raw this week with championship gold on her mind. The irresistible force made her presence known immediately after a segment with Randy Orton, and after demanding a Raw Women's title match, was cut off by Shayna Baszler, resulting in a brawl between the two. It appears that Jax and the Queen of Spades will eventually have a match, but whether that match is for the Raw Women's title or even a shot at the gold remains to be seen. We're looking ahead to SummerSlam next, as the biggest party of the summer could have a very unique venue. Whilst it's been confirmed that the show won't be at Boston's TD Garden, WWE haven't said it'll be at the Performance Center, and according to Mike Johnson of PW Insider, the company are considering hosting the biggest party of the summer on the beach. There are some within WWE who have also thought of hosting the show on a boat, and either option would be a welcomed change to the practical though subdued Performance Center. An outdoor setting like a beach would also mean a higher chance of an actual crowd, though the weather in Florida can be unpredictable, especially in late August. Other options floating around backstage include the show happening in Rhode Island, South Dakota, or Puerto Rico. Steve Carrier of Ringside News noted that these multiple possibilities could be the deliberate intent of Vince McMahon to cause confusion, as ultimately, he's the only one who knows for sure what will happen. Right now, everyone else in the company is hearing many different backup plans being tossed around, so it's hardly surprising that some behind the scenes don't know what to think. Given that the US has an incredibly high number of positive cases across the country, the WWE will have to continue being careful no matter what they choose, and hopefully fans will get some answers as we get closer to the biggest party of the summer. Over to All Elite Wrestling next, as Chris Statlander is preparing to go under the knife today. Statlander suffered a torn ACL during the second week of June, and the company's resident alien took to Twitter to say that she'll be plenty entertained during her recovery watching AEW. There's no current word about how long Statlander will be out for, but with both her and Britt Baker out, as well as a 16-woman tag team tournament planned, the company's women's division will be under a lot of pressure in the coming months. Back to WWE now, and this week's Raw saw Drew McIntyre defeat Dolph Ziggler yet again, this time in a match of Drew's choosing. Before he defeated the show off in an Extreme Rules match, the WWE Champion addressed the comments by Randy Orton, who opened the show by issuing a challenge for the WWE Championship at SummerSlam. Accepting the challenge, McIntyre was able to defeat Ziggler, but was leveled by an RKO from Orton after the match, proving that the Viper is focused on regaining the championship he hasn't held in over 3 years. One man who knows all about gold is former NXT champion Adam Cole, who recently made headlines for a confrontation with Pat McAfee. After the former NFL punter criticized Cole's height and added that he was only NXT champion for so long because of the Undisputed Era, the superstar stormed off following an expletive-filled rant, something that Cole now regrets. In a statement on Twitter, the former NXT champion explained himself, saying, "I've had the weekend to think about everything, and it's still hard to put into words where to begin. First of all, to anyone that I offended, I apologize. I apologize because I represent a brand that commands respect, not just because of what we do in the ring, but how we handle ourselves outside the ring. Even though he continued to push my buttons, I still should have kept my composure and acted like a professional. I'm embarrassed by my reaction, and I will make sure something like that never happens again. Thanks for the continued support, everyone." The jury's still out on whether this confrontation was a shoot or a work, though Cole is clearly playing it straight. But McAfee wasn't too impressed by the apology. On his show, Pat said it was nice of Cole to apologize for how he acted and for shoving his producer Ty Schmidt, though noted that the former NXT champion never mentioned either of them by name in his apology. McAfee didn't note whether the ban he put on Cole ever appearing on the show again was lifted or not, as it seems he, Schmidt, and the Undisputed Era are all trying to move on from the situation. Triple H also appeared on Pat's show this week, and after speaking about the tension that existed between the former NFL star and Cole, even before this incident, apologized for the former NXT champion's behavior, saying, "I apologize for Adam coming on your show. There is an interaction between the two of you that I believe is Adam being a little bit overly sensitive, and you, honestly, Pat, being Pat McAfee, you're a professional button pusher. That's what you do. You needle people for a living. You do it very well. I don't know if Florida is in your plans anytime soon. I know you come down there sometimes, so anytime you're around, come on the show. I'll promote your show. I'll promote you just like we've done before. And if you don't want to do it that way, if you just want to you and him sit in a room with nothing else around it and no promotion, not the show, anything like that, I'm fine with that too. This is you and him, man to man. But if you want to do that separately, and because you're in Florida or whatever that is, jump on the show. Whatever. Cool with that too." Time will tell whether McAfee takes Triple H up on his offer, but for now, it seems like the former NFL punter wants nothing to do with the Undisputed Era star. Back to the ring now, and whilst Night 1 of WrestleMania 36 ended with AJ Styles being buried by The Undertaker, the Phenomenal One isn't finished yet with the Phenom. Speaking to BT Sport, Styles explained why he wants to face the man who he lost the Boneyard match to, and even offered his Intercontinental title as a bargaining chip to the dead man. He said, "Undertaker's never been the IC champ. I'll put it on the line against you, and if you can friggin' beat me, I'll leave WWE forever. But if I win, you leave. There's the story behind that one. I want The Undertaker at SummerSlam." Although Styles wants this match, that may be easier said than done, as The Undertaker seemingly retired in the 5th episode of his Last Ride docuseries and hasn't competed at SummerSlam since 2015. It's entirely possible that the dead man could be back in time for SummerSlam, though with Styles set to defend his title against Gran Metalik on this week's SmackDown, the IC title may not be a factor in this potential rematch. That wasn't all Styles had to say this week, as after critiquing Dixie Carter's running of Impact Wrestling, the Intercontinental Champion has added that he's turned down being inducted into Impact's Hall of Fame. Speaking on his Twitch channel, Styles explained his reasons for turning down the induction, which would have seen him join stars like Sting, Kurt Angle, the Dudley Boys, and Gail Kim, saying, "It was offered to me, but I was working for ROH and NJPW at the time, and I said, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to a TNA event when I'm working for someone else. I didn't think it was right, and I was still wrestling. I always think it's weird when people are still wrestling and you want to put them in the Hall of Fame. Wait till they retire. As long as I'm working for WWE, I definitely wouldn't do it. Not saying I wouldn't ever, but if I'm working for another company, I'm not doing it." Given that the Phenomenal One signed a brand new contract with WWE last year, we doubt the company will be letting him go anytime soon, even if it was for one night to be inducted. The irony of all this is, despite the fact that Styles has spent much less time in WWE than Impact, the former world champion is a shoo-in for the WWE's Hall of Fame, and we're sure the Phenomenal One will have plenty to say when that time comes. From one SmackDown star to another now, as Lacey Evans has threatened to walk out of WWE all over a picture. The Lady of WWE was very upset already about her segment on SmackDown, but was even more miffed when the company posted a photo from her match with Naomi, which saw Evans with lipstick all over her face and teeth. Responding to a tweet with the photo, Evans said she demanded the photo was deleted and said that the WWE should prepare to give her paid time off if it remains. At this stage, it wouldn't matter if WWE deleted the photo as Evans had demanded, as nothing ever really disappears online, and time will tell whether the sassy Southern Belle makes good on her promise to walk away. We are focusing on WWE's deal with Saudi Arabia next, as despite criticism from fans and people outside of wrestling, the company has shown no signs of cutting their contracts short. Even given the current global situation, the WWE hasn't ruled out returning to the Middle Eastern nation later this year, as in a conference call, Vince McMahon said it was a possibility, as Saudi Arabia is reportedly faring better in the current situation than the US, though added that nothing's for certain. In the past, the WWE superstars haven't been too thrilled about being over there, especially after they were held up for an extra day last year. But for now, it seems Vince McMahon is fine with having his superstars perform in Saudi Arabia one more time in 2020. And we're ending today with news from WWE's Hall of Fame. As though we previously mentioned that AJ Styles is a shoo-in, there's still no actual building for the Hall of Fame. In that same conference call to company shareholders, Vince McMahon said how the company aren't a big fan of brick-and-mortar places unless it's one of their office buildings. With that in mind, the chairman of the board admitted that he was aware of the interest in a physical Hall of Fame that fans would be able to visit, and said there was a possibility of an actual hall being a reality somewhere down the line. With the current global situation showing no signs of slowing down, the WWE has a lot to consider already before they start thinking about constructing a Hall of Fame and opening it to the public. But with legends like JBL, Batista, the British Bulldog, and others yet to be officially inducted this year, as the Hall of Fame ceremony was postponed, hopefully it won't be too long before these stars receive what they deserve.